We're thrilled to have John Mapes with us today, Managing Partner of Aurora Capital, in a fireside chat with Senior Associate Dean and Professor Al Osborne. Aurora is a private equity investment firm with over $2.5 billion in assets under management. Their investment portfolio focuses on middle market companies across the country, primarily in engineered products, distribution, and tech-enabled services. John leads Aurora's private equity practice, is chairman of the investment committee, and a member of the firm's executive committee. He is also a proud UCLA graduate and former athlete. He earned a bachelor's degree in economics and business in 1990 while playing varsity tennis for the Bruins. He went on to earn an MBA from Harvard Business School and returned to Aurora, where he has been instrumental ever since. It is rather fitting to conclude our afternoon at UCLA Anderson with John Mapes and Dean Al Osborne together in conversation. John and Al have some important things in common. They both sit on numerous corporate boards, lending their expertise to a broad array of firms. Even more importantly, they both bleed Bruin blue and gold. John and his wife, Carrie, who is here today, have passed on their UCLA tradition to their children and have been profoundly generous with their support of UCLA programs. Al clearly wears his UCLA Anderson pride for all to see. In fact, the reason that we got delayed a little bit is that John requested a hat as well.
If Al's going to wear one, I'm going to wear one.
There we go. Okay, so let's please welcome John Mapes and Dean Al Osborne.
Thank you. Lori, thank you very much. And we really appreciate all that you do to help make the FINK Center the robust entity that it is becoming. If it's all right, John, let's start a little bit. You've heard Lori introduce Aurora. Let's go a little bit and talk about private equity in general. And how do you see things happening in the industry, particularly here in Los Angeles? When if I recall correctly, you guys were one of the first firms in this town to really break out that way. And tell me a little bit of how you see all of that shaping up here.
Well, I'm just curious, if we were to make an assumption that the last, let's call it since 2010, the average private equity firm would return, call it 13% net of fees, last 7 years, on average. I'm just picking that number, but it's probably pretty close. Just show of hands, who thinks in the next 7 years private equity will deliver more than 10% net? Who thinks, show of hands, that private equity will deliver less than 10% net? Yeah, so there you have it. When Aurora first started in this business, Al, as you know, and we were about to buy a business, we would typically sign a letter of intent directly with the sellers, no investment banker typically. We would have about 3.5 months to do our due diligence. So as a young guy, I would literally go down to the Target. Carrie remembers I'd be gone a lot. And I'd move into the controller, into the office next to the controller, and we would sit down there as a group and do about 3 months of due diligence. We would get to know the senior management. We'd understand where cash flow moved in the business. We got a very good feel for where the business was going. And after 3.5 months alone doing due diligence, we'd be able to negotiate a purchase agreement that had reps and warranties that would last 3 to 5 years. We'd have escrows to protect us if something went wrong after we bought it. Fast forward today, extremely competitive industry. A lot of money has flowed into our industry for reasons we can talk about, more firms around. Now, when we look at a business, we're lucky to be at the business for maybe a day and a half. We get a management presentation, and if we really behave ourselves, we'll get invited back to maybe spend another half day with management. When we go to the purchase and sale agreement, call it 3 weeks later, it's almost like buying a residential house today. It's as is, where is. No reps and warranties, public document, everything expires. So the ice we're skating on in private equity is extremely thin compared to where we came from. And so at Aurora, we've never been in better shape as a firm. We've raised our largest private equity fund ever. We have a really strong team. Mark Rosenbaum, Anderson graduate, manages the firm with me today. He's spectacular. We haven't lost anyone in over 10 years. You know, we moved some people in and out like any businesses, but we haven't lost anyone. And the portfolio is doing extremely well, but we're nervous. Our industry has become so competitive that while we've continued to innovate in the past, we're going to have to start finding new ways to innovate, because you've seen conventional wisdom here that says, you know, returns in the next 7 years are probably not going to be near what they've been in the last 7 years. And you know, a lot of money in the industry, purchase prices going up, ice getting thinner. So having said that, I don't think there's a better asset class in private equity if properly executed. Low rate environment in the last many years, so that's attracted a lot more money into the business. But you know, for those private equity firms who really know what they're doing and are committed to innovating, you know, a lot of firms have specialized. A lot of firms have brought in operating executives. You name it. But innovation will have to continue to happen.
Well, you know, as you innovate and how you differentiate yourself, kind of tell us what's the sweet spot at Aurora these days.
Yep. We're very simple. You know, listening a little bit to the earlier equity panel talk about, you know, where you think GDP is going to be, where the macros are going to be. But we don't have to worry about all of that because we've decided we don't have any edge there. We're pretty simple. We are in the middle market. So on average, enterprise values for companies we look at, 300 to 400 million in enterprise value. So large enough where there's a durable business model and management team, yet small enough where we feel like we can really move the equity needle if we find some ways and some initiatives to work on. We only invest in 2 areas now. Half of what we do is in the industrial space, specialty manufacturing, distribution. The other half is in tech services. We only do control. We only make control investments. Very important to our strategy. So we're very narrow in terms of what we focus on. I think we're very, very good at what we focus on, but we're very, very narrow compared to an oak tree. You heard Jay talk this morning about what they do, or some of the long-short manager. We're only control, we're only long, we're in a couple of different, we only fish in a couple of different ponds. At the end of the day, we like to solve for a very specific return profile. We call it one of relatively high alpha and kind of relatively low beta by trying to do a couple of things superbly well. Asset selection, and then bringing our operating playbook to bear after we buy it and before we sell it. So in terms of asset selection, as I mentioned, we admit that we don't feel like we have an edge in terms of calling where GDP is going to be, calling where interest rates are going to be. So we actually work pretty hard to invest, God bless you, away from that, right? So on the front end, we're almost looking to buy bonds with upsides. And we solve for stability, bless you, 3 different ways every time. We have an underwriting criteria. It's our strike zone, and we really believe in it, and we're committed to it. And in that strike zone, we have a criteria that pretty much will assuredly lead us to very stable industry structures. It'll lead us to businesses that have very stable demand drivers, because we don't want to have to call cycles. And it'll lead us to businesses where we don't have to over-leverage them to deliver the 20% plus returns that we're targeting. So we like to say, if we do our job really well on asset selection, and we just bought the company and went to sleep and showed up 6, 7 years later, we'd probably return all the capital with a modest return, but we said that would be a recipe for a pretty boring return profile in private equity. So the key for us is after we buy that stability, we've got to bring our operating playbook to bear to really drive earnings consistently higher and faster.
And of course, then the strategy would be is to put sort of the playbook in place would mean getting to efficiencies and getting to scale in the sense of being acquisitive with the platform company in this narrow niche. Is that a fair way of thinking about kind of on the back end how you say juice the return that would be possible for an otherwise plain vanilla strategy?
Yeah, that's exactly what we do. So, and it's typically not a one-size-fits-all strategy, but depending on what we're looking at, what we're working on is, again, buying that bond and then identifying 3 to 5 initiatives that we deeply believe in, that we think we can impact to drive the equity rep. One of them could be growing the top line organically through better pricing, more volume. One of them could be inorganically through acquisition. In fact, we do a lot of that, and that's added a lot of value to our portfolio. But important, we don't want 10 initiatives because literally that's like 0 in our business. It's just too much. We want 3 to 5, and if we do our job really well and just get 2 to 3 of them done, we'll usually get home in terms of the return profile we're aiming for.
Looking at, say, 5 years,
Yeah,
perhaps.
yeah.
Let's drill down a little bit here on your control approach to this. This is control for the equity, let's say, and does that find itself in you controlling the board, or so you're more active than passive in that context? And then do you invest by yourself, or do you have a special group of partners that you always lay off some of the equity that might be needed? How do you think about all of that?
Yeah.
And then sort of, because that means that you're pretty patient throughout all of this. You got to turn over a lot of rocks and kiss a lot of frogs and hope that one of them is a prince. Is that the way the story goes?
We hope so. We hope so. It's interesting. We probably look at an investment opportunity per day, but we typically only make 2 to 3 investments per year.
Per year.
So we're writing, equity checks of, $200 million. But you mentioned something really important to us, and that is we only invest where we control the entire equity. So well over 50%, usually upwards of 80 to 90%, with management either rolling over and holding the remainder. And so control for us is exactly what you just mentioned. And I know, governance is one of your bailiwicks, but we control the board, which effectively means we control the balance sheet, which effectively means we get to choose who run our businesses. We have the opportunity to hire and fire and move people around.
And what leverage you want to play with, if at all?
Yeah, that's pretty. So on average, last 10 years, our debt to equity ratio going into our investments has only been about 1 to 1. So
Okay.
our governor on the amount of debt that we use is usually us, not the market. We can usually get a lot more, but we opt not to. In fact, the way we start our investments at Aurora is so we've generated 21% compounded annual returns the last 14 years. Those are levered returns. We love 20% plus returns, but we also look at unlevered returns. So when we're first looking at an investment, before we add $1 of debt, we literally look at what the cash-on-cash yield is with just all equity. Literally, we run the models, no debt at all. If we can't find a 10 to 14% unlevered return
On all equity.
on all equity, we'll move on. In other words, we love 23% returns, but not when you start with an unlevered return of 5%. It means you're having to use too much leverage and too much risk in the investment.
Fully diluted with a piece to management.
Exactly. So we're doing things the old-fashioned way. It's easy to say, hard to do, but it's kind of 3 yards.
Well, it's you guys you've stayed the course. So obviously a lot is working, and it's producing not shabby lifestyles for principals.
We paid off a lot of mortgages.
And in this town, that's something good to do. But more importantly, thinking about how your fundraising strategies here now, you are obviously, I've known you for 25 years, is that fair enough? And I knew Jerry, and he's moved up. And so what's the future like? How you guys think of succession in the private equity business, and how you think about it at Aurora? I know you've got Mark and some of the other outstanding young investors, but how are you grooming people to sort of take over the next generation, maybe go after the next fund, or is there one in the horizon? How are you thinking about, even though you just raised a bunch of money?
So we finished it. A lot of firms in private equity. We're not an old industry, so this is succession is a really big topic, and it's one that we talk about all the time at the portfolio companies that we invest in. Do you have the right people in the right place with the right jobs? Are you tracking where succession is? If so and so has to leave, but private equity has usually not done a great job, at the front. At Aurora, we've solved that. We've worked really hard on that, and I mentioned earlier, Mark Rosenbaum, for example, a graduate of Anderson. He and Michael Marino and Josh Kleinfelter, actually, what's very fulfilling for me, these are guys I hired over a decade ago. And I've run the investment program as kind of the managing partner for most of the last 15 years, but just last year we promoted Mark and Michael and Josh to run this new fund with me. And that is really fulfilling. I mean, it's just, I train these guys, and now our partnership is more full and it's stronger. So in private equity, while we're an older firm, our leadership is relatively young. And I think what really aligns us as a group and a firm, all the way down to Steve Marks, who just came back from Harvard and joined us about 6 months ago, is we have a very clear vision at Aurora. I mean, we talk about, like, our vision at Aurora is to be the partner of choice, for example, to our investors. And we talk about it all the time. What that means to us is that when we go raise our next fund, we want to have done such a superb job in delivering not just returns, but delivering great behavior, that we don't have to fly out anymore to raise our next fund. We want to literally be able to pick up the phone and have them call it in. Now, we're there with some of our investors. We are not there with all of our investors, but that's our dream. That's our mission. I mean, everyone at Aurora is literally, everything we do, every decision we make together as a team is put through that lens. And I will tell you, as a leader, I have found, especially with a lot of our leaders running our portfolio companies, you probably feel the same. The more senior you get, the less you're in the office, right? You're with suppliers, you're with customers, you're with investors. And the problem is, if your vision isn't really clear, set by leadership, I can guarantee you that people aren't very clear. And that means they're probably frustrated and wasting time. But if the leadership is really clear in their vision, you don't have to be in the office for great decisions to be made. Like, I can guarantee you right now, as I'm sitting here, lots of great decisions are being made at Aurora right now. So we've solved succession, but more importantly, everyone there is aligned with kind of our vision. We're focused on the 3 to 5 things that we need to do superbly well to get to the vision, which means we spend our time pretty efficiently. And last thing I'll say is difference between, in my opinion, private equity, sports, industry, difference between playoff teams and championship teams. Both have talent. Championship teams, though, they really like running together. They're willing to do different jobs extremely well for each other. That's where we are right now.
Well, that gets us to an important question today, and that has to do with the culture of the firm.
Yeah.
And clearly, if people aren't on the same page, you're going to have an agency problem even within the organization. Forget about portfolio companies. So how do you bring that about? I mean, how do people, when they think of Aurora and what we have to do when they get hired, how do they buy into the values and the moral compass? And there's issues of ethics and so on that become important to keeping your proposition forward. How do you make sure that people don't get off the rail, for example?
Yeah, so a couple of ways. Having a very clear vision. I mean, a vision that you're literally able to write down on a piece of paper in 2 to 3 sentences is really important for the organization to do. In fact, it's not just important for leadership, but can the other people in the organization write it down? And so again, coming back to our vision of being the partner of choice to our investors, in order to do that, I mentioned we not only have to generate a lot of return relative to the risk we're taking, but our behavior, the firm's behavior has to be aligned with that vision too. So those are things we talk about: integrity, making sure you do what you say you're going to do. A return profile, I said, that we're solving for. We want to make sure that we invest in exactly the way that we can deliver that return profile. So if we don't deliver that return profile, it's not going to be because we did something differently than what we said. The other thing is important, at least at Aurora, in culture, is we're pretty committed to making sure that everyone in the firm, all the way to the top, has a pretty effective feedback loop. So everyone at Aurora is a leader in one way or another. In fact, my definition of leader for this discussion and for things we talk about, you ask 10 different people definition of a leader, you probably get 10 different answers. Our definition of a leader at Aurora is someone who thinks about what they believe, which sometimes isn't easy, but they think very carefully about what they believe. They then work to get conviction on it, and then they've got the courage to act on it. Okay? And we have a lot of leaders within Aurora doing a lot of really important things. But this feedback loop we have is really important. Everyone at Aurora has a quarterback. They have a coach. And the reason why feedback loops are really important for leaders is because you got to have some mechanism where you know what's going on in your company, or more importantly, you know how you're performing as a leader. And oddly enough, the more senior you get as a leader, in my opinion, the more difficult that feedback loop gets. Because like Jay Wintrob today, a lot of you heard, Jay's the CEO of Oak Tree. I can guarantee you a lot of smart people at Oak Tree, not a lot of people at Oak Tree though, that are just walking into Jay's office uninvited telling Jay how he can run a better investment committee. But I would argue as a leader, especially a senior leader, you need a mechanism or some people who can be brutally honest with you, so you can check how you're doing and improve and turn the dial a little bit so you can do a better job ultimately for the firm you're running or the customers you're serving.
Tell you the truth. Be transparent.
Yeah.
A lot of folks are good at managing up and do a terrible job of managing down. So I like the way you describe the circle that keeps everybody, in a sense, honest and aligned. And that minimizes surprises.
Yeah.
You ever been surprised by something, even this well-oiled machine that you've got here? Ever been surprised at something one of your guys did?
Oh yeah, we do. But
Then how do you deal with it? That's what
well, cement hardens quickly, so we get at it pretty quickly. So
yeah, we got quick cement these days.
Yeah,
too.
we
really
have very
hardened right away.
So we get after it pretty quickly, but leadership has to figure out a way to be engaged enough in their business to know about surprises. For example, one of the things I worry about most at Aurora right now is something that we can't control, and that is cybersecurity, right? Big deal. If your boards aren't talking about if your executives aren't talking about the risk of cybersecurity, for example, your board should be talking about the risk of cybersecurity. But that's one thing I'm worried about, because not that it could happen. I think it probably will happen, but I think where firms get in trouble is they don't know it's happening, and then when it happens, they don't know what to do. And so those are more of the things that I'm worrying about today. I think from a talent, a leadership management perspective, I think we've got a pretty good thing in place. Back to that though.
Yeah.
In terms of feedback loop, like I have a coach within Aurora today. I've always had one. Someone younger than me, but someone who I go and have coffee with every month, every other month. And I ask them, I say, I want you to think about how I did in this investment committee meeting, or how I did in this situation, and I want you to, what am I not doing enough of? What should I be doing more of? And so those are the kind of things that's what we're doing at Aurora to make sure that we're all aligned, moving in the right, and that we minimize surprises. Yeah. And mistakes are okay, we just don't like making them twice.
Yeah. Well, presumably it's an opportunity to learn and improve, and because there are going to be mistakes, and if there are no mistakes, you're obviously not doing the best you can for your stakeholders, because at some point you have to take on risk or there's no return.
You do.
One of the challenges in private equity today that I've become a little familiar with, that speaks to this question of culture and governance, is how you treat portfolio companies, and how you resolve the conflict with a portfolio company and the interests of the fund vis-a-vis limited partners. That is sometimes when you're sitting on a board, your responsibility is to the company, but sometimes some private equity guys make a decision that's really self-serving, and then they sweep it under the rug. And I'm afraid that that's going to be something that pops up.
Yeah.
If sort of what I hear in the press on the SEC is something that, what do you think is happening there?
Well, that's a good topic. So the way Aurora solves it, I mentioned alignment a couple of times within Aurora. We spend a lot of time making sure before we go into an investment that there's alignment in every area. Alignment with capital structure, how comfortable management is with leverage. we control the business, so,
That's right, so-
effectively we're aligned with the shareholders and of course our limited partners. We don't take on other partners. And so for us, alignment is relatively simple, but private equity in general, they're murky waters with the more in some of the more complicated strategies. You know, some of the club deals. You know, you think you go in aligned one way, and then all of a sudden one of the partners needs to raise a fund, and they're ready to sell, but the management doesn't want to sell. That gets
That's
complicated.
kind of complicated. Yeah.
The SEC, you know, it's a fact of life. You know, we have a young SEC examiner, you know, come to Aurora kind of on schedule, I don't know, every year and a half, and they spend a couple of days. Takes up a lot of time, a lot of resources. They kind of leave with their recommendations. You know, fortunately, we've gotten a very clean bill of health, but you know, a lot of firms haven't, and I would argue it's probably a good thing for our industry. A level of regulation is important to make sure, you know, trust generally between investors and the private equity firms are aligned is good.
I really raise it because I want the audience to appreciate this, the challenge this really poses for those who seek careers as investors or have small funds or do club investing, and then there's a conflict in the board, and fiduciary duty nowadays is such that you really need to pay attention to the interests of the portfolio company more so than yours, and that may create a problem. So I just want to be sure that that got out on the floor for a little bit. Let's switch the conversation. I mean, you're UCLA through and through. You spend a lot of time here at this university. More and more. We appreciate that. You're active in the UCLA Foundation.
Yeah.
And we know there's going to be leadership change shortly. Well, I think actually Justin is going to be take over for a while.
Yep.
And you're involved with the Technology Development Group. Tell us a little bit about how you see UCLA today and your participation in the governance of some important institutions here.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you know, Al is right. We do bleed blue in our family. We don't wear red very often. And I was mentioning to Al, you know, a while ago, I've taken a lot away from UCLA. I was able to take a degree away in econ business. I was able to take a letter away and playing varsity tennis. And I met my wife as a freshman, Carrie. And so I actually took my future spouse away. So it was a good run. And now I'm actually able to give a lot back. And I have been spending a lot more time on campus, and that's been part of the fun. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I was mentioning to Alex or Lori that I think I was actually on campus every single day of the week for some reason. So that's been fun. In terms of UCLA, it's so the foundation has been great. Meyer Luskin, a couple of years ago, who I've known for a number of years, thought that I'd enjoy the board and could perhaps add some value. And the first is true. The second, jury's out on that. But on the foundation board, yeah, so I'll be taking over the chair in June. And that's been a lot of, you know, what's been most fun is I've been so aligned with athletics since graduation. I've been very involved in keeping up to speed with that part of the campus. The beauty of kind of being on the foundation board and now with TDG is being able to see all the other great things that are going on across this campus. Went down to Asia with Chancellor Block to do some fundraising in I think it was October. Got to spend a lot of time with a number of the deans who are overseeing, I mean, incredibly talented leadership at this school. And you know what, just like most things, the strong keep getting stronger. We've got, about a $7.5 billion budget to run the whole system, including the hospital system here this year.
Yep. We've got a $4.2 billion campaign, and you've been active in helping us close that out.
We're going to bring the Centennial campaign across the finish line next year, which will be a really fun time to chair the foundation board. So getting to meet our leadership, being involved a little bit in terms of thinking about strategy for UCLA going forward has been a real privilege. By the way, you know, the foundation board, the fiduciary duty of the foundation board, you know, really twofold, right? It's to manage the endowment across the campus and then determine the payout of that endowment each year, which helps with the budgets across the university. And then a mission, obviously, is to promote philanthropy. And, you know, we hope everyone on the foundation board are good role models for that.
Let there be light.
Yeah.
Well, I have one more question, and then for those of you who may have a question in mind, this might be a time for you to begin to formulate it. Southern California is being touted as a growing place for high technology activities. You know, we got coming back in the aerospace. You've got a few niches there that you're doing well in.
Yeah.
And how do you see all of this Silicon Beach stuff? And how do you feel about or think about what that might mean for the larger economy? I mean, I know the basic transportation and other things have a potential for being strong, but how do you see I know you don't talk about the big climate, but as you look at where you invest,
Yeah.
what's your thought about the region?
Yeah.
Let's just say the political leadership in the region.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need to go any further than that.
Yeah.
Is it aligned with the kinds of things you would like to see as a business person in making sort of, if you think about the infrastructure, for example, that's necessary to really do business?
Yeah.
How do you see all of that coming out, John?
Yep, so I'm a buyer of California, from Northern California to Southern California, in part because of technology. As I mentioned at Aurora, half of what we do is in the industrial space. Mm-hmm. But honestly, I feel like we're almost a complete technology firm now, because technology has been so pervasive in all of our industrial businesses in terms of helping those businesses, leverage technology and do things better, faster, cheaper. So I'm long California primarily because I think technology has a long, long runway. I think we're early innings. I think the whole Silicon Beach thing is terrific. And I think UCLA can play an absolute major role there. I think I heard I believe this is the case, Al, you'll correct me, but I think there's almost like an invention per day coming out of the ecosystem at UCLA in some form or fashion, out of the engineering, out of the physics department, and being able to have our inventors and professors be in the middle of this enormous incubation, I think is terrific. And it's going to be really important for California. It's going to be important for UCLA. As I mentioned, $7.5 billion to run the whole UCLA
Mm-hmm.
system. There was a decade where we'd get a lot of state support.
Those days are gone.
Those days are gone. Was it 9-10% now of our budget? Certainly going.
And going down.
I will predict this. It'll go down. And so we need to figure out ways, obviously, where we can find new revenue lines at UCLA. We can't really increase tuition any longer. In my opinion, we've kind of hit the ceiling on that. Yep. But technology and what we're doing at TDG in terms of putting together a group that can kind of look across this ecosystem to pull out technologies that can, A, change the world, fight diseases, incredibly inspiring. And by the way, if UCLA can find a revenue stream, Tom Unterman did a great job in terms of generating almost $1.4 billion for the drug the drug royalty that we just sold. That is actually a gold mine in terms of finding revenue for UCLA, which is great because we'll take that money, fund our laboratories and our people more, which will cause more inventions, which will cause better things to solve the world and disease. And so it's for that reason I think UCLA, even amongst the UC schools, UCLA and Berkeley traditionally being the strongest, I think they'll continue. I think we will definitely continue to get stronger, especially because of the technology, and we'll be able to fulfill our mission, which is globally impacting the world.
Well, it sounds like a good prediction for UCLA in Southern California.
Wow, I'm a buyer.
There you go. Well, John Mapes, ladies and gentlemen. Well, let me open this up to the audience. Well, how are you, young man?
Good.
Would you like to ask the first question?
Mark Schwartz. I had the pleasure of being a student in Dr. Osborne's corporate governance and board certification class 3 years ago. Also spent some time at Soldiers Field as well. I want to go back to your education at UCLA, specifically your tennis, your sports. What do you think you got from that experience? What traits, what skills, what disciplines that impact your professional life? And how important is sports in sort of when you're interviewing people to come into your firm and looking at their athletic activity as well as their academic and work experience?
Yeah, great question. So I think a lot of different ways to try on leadership at a young age. I think playing athletics and being part of a athletic program at UCLA is an exceptional way for young adults to try on leadership. So when I was playing tennis, 1987, national championships down in Georgia. We'd beaten Stanford in the semis. We were playing Georgia in Georgia. That was a year where our team started out okay, but we ended the year really strong. And I remember the joy of actually being part of a group that really liked each other, that were really effective with each other, and that were almost willing to do anything for each other. And as a result, while we didn't win the national championship that year, being up close to that sort of development, that's hard to replicate in business at a young age. But that was one lesson that really has impacted me as I kind of have gone on, and we've kind of created a great culture at Aurora in terms of being very careful who we select and how we can really develop each of our individuals professionally and personally is important. So that made a big impact on me. The other thing is actually being able to play for a legendary tennis coach, Glenn Bassett, at the time. Coach retired a couple of years later, but I had the privilege of playing for Coach, and there wasn't a more prepared executive or teacher than Coach Bassett. There wasn't a more competitive individual, especially in the world of tennis, than Coach Bassett. But when we lost that match in 1987, one of the players for Georgia years later came up to me and said, how lucky you were to play under a great leader like Coach Bassett. After the match, I knew it must have been turning his stomach that it was a close match that we lost. But he actually still went across to the other team. He said, Coach shook all of our hands, looked us in the eyes, and told us congratulations, and we actually thought he meant it. It was actually that authentic. And, with Coach, it was. And so being able to play for a leader like that who was competitive and focused, but at the end of the day did things the right way, left an indelible mark.
Mark, I just need to say that one of the things we're adopting here in the Leadership Foundations at the Anderson School is the John Wooden Global Leadership Awards. Talk about legendary coaches. There's one for an eternity. And his values transcend business. And we select business leaders to honor every year based on how well they do in their organizations with those kinds of values. And we got some great coaches here at UCLA. And, you don't get to 116 without some real moxie. And we need to talk about, Ms. Val.
Yeah.
And what she did.
Unbelievable.
With the gymnastics team.
Out of nowhere.
So.
By the way, Coach Wooden, given that Paulie's not too far from here, what an outstanding, when you talk about a leader, at least the way I define, what a visionary leader Coach Wooden was. I think all the great leaders, in my career that I've been fortunate enough to come across, and there have been a lot of them, they all have a way to express a very clear vision. And Coach Wooden was a visionary leader. Remember his vision of success, not whether you win or lose, but self-satisfaction. Everyone can probably finish the sentence. I heard it took him 10 years to build that pyramid, to actually get to the exact definition of success he wanted. And let there be no doubt, when Lou Alcindor, playing at Power Memorial High School in New York back in the 60s, when everyone wanted him to play, every coach wanted him, he chose to come to UCLA 3,000 miles away, in part because I believe the vision of Coach is so clear. Not a doubt in my mind when Kareem stepped on campus, he knew exactly Coach's vision of success for not only the team but him. So, what a visionary leader.
Absolutely. That makes me think a little bit about, if you don't mind me interjecting myself again for a second here. When you think of business leaders that you've looked at, we do well here with Croak. Is there one or two that stand out in your life as, maybe there's a legendary private equity investor that you try to channel or something? Is there something like that in your life too, John?
You know, there isn't any, let me answer it this way.
Okay.
Rather than give a specific answer, I think there's a couple of common things, at least in the great leaders that I've come across. They do two things. The great leaders I know are, like I said, are very clear on the vision, right? We talked about Coach Wooden, visionary coach. Another good example is Barack Obama. I thought he was a visionary candidate. I won't talk about what he did once he was in office, but I would argue he won the election because he was very clear at the time where he wanted to take the country. In my opinion, it wasn't around change. It was actually around unification. Remember that great speech in 2004 at the convention he gave? It's not a black America, white America, rich America, poor. It's a United States of America. Visionary candidate. So the great leaders, they're very clear in their vision. They can write it down usually in 2 or 3 sentences, and they talk about it enough that everyone in the organization can talk about the vision. The second thing is the great leaders and very clear on the 3 to 5 tasks that the company or they need to do superbly well to enable the vision to happen. Again, not 10, but 3 to 5. And I've found as a leader, if you aren't spending most of your time as a leader on those 3 to 5 priorities, you're probably underperforming your leadership potential and probably underperforming the organization. So those are the two
Those
things.
are the things you look for.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, sir. And who are you?
My name is Jeevan Anand, and I did MBA here.
Yes.
Professor Osborne mentioned that managing up is easy, managing down is very hard. Could you give us a few tips on managing down?
That's a good question.
That is a good question. Again, I think it's really hard to manage down. I think the biggest risk for leaders is something called isolation. It's my biggest fear as a leader. It's when you get old enough and senior enough, as I mentioned before, it's very easy for people not to shoot you straight or to tell you the truth, or they round the edges. This is kind of where the importance of a coach comes in. So I think in terms of managing down effectively, I think you really need to be engaged in what is going on in your company, and I think you need to be engaged with what people are thinking about you and the strategy. I really don't think you can effectively manage down if you're lacking data like that.
Good. Let me see if there's anybody in the back, then I'll come back to the front. And who are you, sir?
My name is Sean Aurora. And I was curious about building a firm that's going to be built to last, and you're thinking about succession management. I'm hearing a lot of rumblings about the 2 and 20, and that needs to evolve. I'm curious about your take on incentive structures in a firm, building a firm that's going to survive. Do you think 2 and 20 is going to keep going, or is there another model that you're looking at?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's probably, again, situation dependent. There's probably not a one-size-fits-all answer. I think for firms who are continually delivering, 20% returns, 15 to 20% net returns, I think it's going to be pretty hard not to pay 2 and 20, or even more, quite frankly, to those sort of firms. I do think as the industry matures, and you're already starting to see it, you're starting to see a lot of private equity investors offer a lot of co-investment, free, fee-free, carry-free. Effectively, that's given a little bit of a price discount. So I think as our industry matures, I actually think 2 and 20 will be around a while because, again, I think properly executed, private equity is the best asset class out there. I think it's hard to find the right managers, but for those managers who do it the right way, I think they deserve 2 and 20. Self-serving a little bit, but.
Do you think there ought to be like a gate on price, or on assets? 2 and 20 may work for, say, funds with less than $2 billion, but maybe if you have $10 billion, maybe it's 1 in 10? I'm just throwing out some numbers.
I don't think so. I think the market.
market will tell.
I think the market's going to tell you where your fees need to be.
Okay, good. I'm for that. The market will tell you.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
My name is Steven, and I have a couple of ventures that make up the Silicon Beach community. But my question to you is from the last panel was in terms of outlook. There's two factors that could actually play a role in terms of what could dictate the markets. That could be the political climate with midterm elections approaching in November, and also a return of reduced regulation, and you're starting to see subprime lending coming back for the housing market. So what do you think is your outlook for the next 2 to 3 years? And also, what would you say was one of the biggest valuable lessons learned from the financial crisis as we approach the 10-year anniversary in September?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of politics, I think I don't think a lot is going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. I think there will be a lot of rhetoric. I think the issue of the trade war is going on right now. I think there will be a lot more talk than things that actually really impact investing. But again, I think it depends on where you invest too. I mean, we are working hard to invest away from things like healthcare that are heavily regulated. We're investing away from industries where probably the largest determinant of our success may be on things we can't control, oil and gas. If we're looking at an investment where the main driver of our return will be calling where the price of a barrel of oil is, we'll probably move on. We probably wouldn't buy an aluminum company right now, or a company heavily dependent on aluminum, because if there are some trade tariffs going up, we would probably see it in that area. So I guess the answer is we're not sure. I think what we are doing, though, at Aurora is we're working pretty hard to find areas to invest away from that, as far away as we can, so that once we own a company, the drivers of value will be typically within the four walls of that business. Can we control pricing better? Can we make productivity? Can we generate more productivity? I mean, outside of financial engineering, there's only a couple, 3 different ways to increase earnings, right? Raise price, get more volume, or increase productivity. Those are the sort of things we're thinking about all of the time. And if we can't find 3 to 5 ways to do that with a company we buy, we'll move on to the next opportunity. So that's at least the way Aurora is looking at it.
John, before we entertain maybe the last couple of questions, I have to ask you a particularly sticky question. And it has to do with the issue of diversity in private equity and gender equity concerns. And it's something I've struggled with some of the firms that that I'm associated with. But what is it what's going on when in private equity, this is a bigger issue than your firm in terms of the talent and women in private equity, the lack of diversity. How do you think about that, and what do you think the industry can do, if anything?
Yeah, well, I think the industry probably gets a D grade, and I think Aurora gets a D grade. I think we're working on it right now. Yeah. I think from a ethnicity perspective, we're pretty diverse, but from a gender, we aren't. Yeah. And so we think we're going to take a big step in solving that, in the next 3 to 4 months. But we at Aurora in the industry have gotten a D, and we need to change that.
But you're proactively trying to figure out how you can do something about
100%. Yeah, it's a priority for us right now. And by the way, we think we're going to be a better firm because of it.
Sure.
There's no question. So yeah, it's a priority.
Cognitive diversity actually can help because there are different points of views as you look at an investment that they make.
100%.
Good for you. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about your playbook.
Yeah.
How different are the playbooks from one private equity firm to another? And do you collaborate with other private equity firms and Silicon Valley? Is that your secret sauce? But how did you build it, just from experience?
Yeah. So we really don't share that much. We don't partner with other private equity groups. We're pretty insular. I think the way our playbook came about a little by luck, in that we have spent a lot of time in a few industries, and as a result of that, we've attracted some really talented operating executives in those areas. And as we kind of, over time, we started to develop a lot of expertise, quite frankly, because of the talent we had around our table. And so we decided, instead of running, a pro-style offense, we're going to do the run and shoot just because of the people we had. And so today, our operating playbook, is really focused on the skills that we have around the table. So, we're very, we've got some operating executives who are just terrific at, helping a business in the U.S. go to Asia. We have some executives who are terrific at being able to take a look at a company that operates out of 5 plants and maybe should do 3 plants. We've got some technology executives who are just outstanding in terms of new product development. So our playbook is probably different than from a lot of it, which is why, by the way, when we get out into the market and there could be 5 other private equity groups looking at a target, our playbook just may be better aligned for that situation, which is why we may be the high-priced owner of that business, but still feel pretty confident that we're going to be able to deliver the returns our investors expect.
And if anybody would like to ask the last question, I'm willing to.
By the way, I was going to say the one place I really get constantly brutally honest feedback is my house.
And
Don't need a coach there.
well, as it should be, John, as it should be. And Madeline, do you want to take the last question?
Yeah. So speaking of diversity, not from a talent perspective, but from geography, could you describe how diverse you are regionally?
With our investments. So everything in our portfolio is headquartered in the United States. Having said that, most of our business operate all over the world, but all of the headquarters of our businesses are in the United States. And they're pretty diverse. We have a handful of companies down the Southeast, Northeast, a lot of Midwest, especially in the industrial stuff. And I will say, one of the advantages of, look, the last thing New York needs is another Aurora Capital. But out in Los Angeles, there aren't that many of us out here doing this at a particular scale. So that is helpful. So we, in every portfolio, will typically have 2 or 3 companies that are actually in California as well. And we love that because of the board meetings, we don't need to get on planes. So.
Well, with that, John, I'm going to bring this to a close. It's been delightful chatting with you.
Dr.
And you and I could go on a little bit longer, but we're what stands between this audience and their next cocktail. So thank you very much for being here.